All right. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the C3 AI DTI seminar series for the full semester. My name is Richard Zhang. I'm assistant professor here at the University of Illinois. I am co-organizing and co-hosting this semester's seminar series with Gary Joshi, who is an associate professor at CMU. So C3 AI DTI features research that focuses on studying how artificial intelligence, machine learning, and big data can lead to scientific breakthroughs with large-scale societal benefits. And before we begin, we would like to pause to acknowledge the support from our academic and industry partners, for which we are deeply grateful. Our fall 2022 series is organized around two special themes: adversarial machine learning and distributed and federated learning. Our talks are scheduled to alternate between these two themes over alternating weeks. We have some really exciting speakers lined up for the semester. Just to give you an idea for the next 4 weeks, today we'll be hearing from Tom Goldstein from the University of Maryland. In the coming few weeks, we'll be hearing from Rachel Cummings from Columbia University, Ping-Yu Chen from IBM, and John Ducci from Stanford University. Videos of previous talks, both from the current seminar series as well as past series, will all be available on our YouTube channel. And we invite you to subscribe to our newsletters and our channel so that you don't miss these talks. So today we're very happy to welcome Professor Tom Goldstein to share his research with his talk entitled Adversarial Machine Learning from a Privacy Perspective. Tom Goldstein is the Pareto Associate Professor of Computer Science at the University of Maryland. His research lies at the intersection of machine learning and optimization and targets applications in computer vision and signal processing. Before joining the faculty at Maryland, Tom completed his PhD in mathematics at UCLA and was a research scientist at Rice University and Stanford University. Of several awards, Goldstein has received SIAM's the Prima Prize, a DARPA Young Faculty Award, a JP Morgan Faculty Award, and a Sloan Fellowship. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Tom Goldstein. The talk will be 50 minutes. So for the audience, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. We'll try to ask them on your behalf at the end of the talk. So whenever you're ready, Tom.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, just double checking you can see my slides. We're good to go?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to tell you a bit about some work I've done recently on adversarial examples, and I'm also going to sort of mash in a different topic at the end. I'll tell you about some of the work that I've done recently on what we call thinking systems or algorithmic reasoning. So I'm going to tell you a bit about adversarial attacks. So what are they? What are some examples of adversarial attacks? And then I want to focus a bit on practical applications of adversarial attacks. I'm particularly interested in the application of adversarial attacks to privacy and data set security. And I'm particularly interested in things that we can use, what ways we can use adversarial attacks to either study existing vulnerabilities, information leaks in systems that already exist, or using adversarial attacks to protect user privacy in various ways. I'll talk about some ways that we can possibly do that. And then finally, at the end, I'll tell you a bit about some of the work I'm doing on thinking systems. Okay, so what is an adversarial attack? Many of you in the audience have probably already seen plenty of these adversarial attacks. You know, a canonical example is where you take an image and you show it to ResNet 50 and it labels it correctly, and then you add a little bit of fuzzy noise to it and you're able to change its label. One of the things I'm interested in my lab is it possible to attack industrial systems with these kinds of attacks? And so one of the studies that we did a couple of years ago now was constructing this invisibility cloak. So we constructed shirts that you could wear that would make you invisible to object detectors. This is an example of me standing in front of a classroom at University of Maryland. And there's these blue boxes around students in the background. Those are placed there by the YOLO detector. The YOLO detector is a very popular object detector that when trained on COCO, it can detect people. But you'll notice that even though I'm standing right in the middle of the image, it doesn't put a blue box around me. And that's because I'm wearing a very strange looking shirt. We actually made a video at one point to sort of demonstrate this. So this is the YOLO detector. You'll see that it sees me and like pick this shirt up. And then the bounding box around me disappears. And actually the bounding box of the person sitting behind me disappears sometimes as well. And one of the interesting things about this shirt is that it only works from the front and the back. It doesn't really work from the side. And actually, there's been some recent follow-up work. There's an interesting paper at CVPR 2022 making this work in an omnidirectional way using various interesting methods. So we made these invisibility shirts. I actually created a website that started selling them. And much to my surprise, the fashion media picked this up and wrote a bit about my my clothing line. I was hoping that it would be good, but it was not always positive. So the New Yorker said that this cloak looks like a baggy sweatshirt with garish colors and formless shapes. So I wasn't too thrilled about that particular review. Then I was surprised to see an article was written about these in the Times of London. So their article said, "This hideous jumper makes Professor Goldstein invisible." So also not the best review, but at least they acknowledge the technical merits of the work. It makes me invisible. Until you read the rest of the sentence, it makes me invisible to the fashion curators at Vogue. So also not the best, reviews. So I showed this sweatshirt to my sister, and she said to me, maybe the reason that it works is because it's so ugly that the computer assumes no person would ever wear it. And that's why it cannot recognize people that are wearing it. So when I heard this and I read these reviews, I decided to set out on a scientific mission to prove to the world that the reason my sweater works is not just because it's ugly. Okay, so first of all, how do we actually create an adversarial pattern that you can wear like this? So we actually train this adversarial pattern much like you might train a machine learning model. So we actually train with a process where we train on the COCO data set. COCO data set is a well-known object detection data set, and there's a lot of people in the data set. So we load up images that contain people, and we run an object detector on them. And in the top, you'll see that it detects a lot of these people, and it outputs a feature map, sort of a heat map that says where the people are, and there's red dots at locations where it thinks that it sees somebody. And then what we do is we render the current version, that's the version that's being trained, the version of this adversarial patch over all the people in the image. And when we render it, we add a little bit of random rescaling, and a little bit of random rotation, a little bit of perspective deformation, and a little bit of noise, and a little bit of nonlinear crumple to sort of simulate what happens in the real world. And then we push this patched image back through the object detector, and it creates a feature map. And now you'll see that most of those red dots, all those red dots in this case, are gone. And that's because this patch is, once partially trained, it's fairly effective. And then what we do to update the patch is we compute the L2 norm of this feature map. And then we backprop through this entire system and make a gradient update to the patch to minimize the L2 norm of the feature map. So we're essentially updating the gradient pattern so that it suppresses this feature map that is used for detecting people. And if we train on the entire COCO data set, over numerous epochs of that data set, we eventually converge to an adversarial pattern that works when it's placed on top of different people in different situations with different backgrounds. So one of the things I wanted to do to test the effectiveness of this patch is just to compare it to some other things. So you might think that the reason my sweater works is just because it's ugly. It has all sorts of strange patterns, strange colors, strange shapes. Maybe any strange thing would defeat an object detector, but it turned out that's not true. So this is an example. At one point, CNN had this expose of people that knit sweaters that camouflage themselves under their background. And so we ran the yellow detector on these images. We found out that the yellow detector consistently finds these people. And actually, it's known that camouflage is not a good way to evade an object detector. Object detector is actually much better at seeing camouflage people than humans are. Here's another example just showing that this adversarial pattern, it's not just about creating weird shapes. There's something very specific about this pattern that exploits the structure of the detector. So I'm standing in a classroom here and I'm holding this adversarial poster up in front of myself. And it detects students in the classroom, but yellow does not detect me. If I then flip the poster upside down, so same poster, I'm just going to hold it upside down. Now I get detected by the yellow detector. And it actually turns out that we were able to quantify the effectiveness of this pattern. When you turn it upside down, it has very little effectiveness against the yellow detector. So it's not just about having certain colors and shapes at certain scales. There really is a very specific pattern that is able to exploit the yellow detector using adversarial methods. Okay, so I've worked a bunch on adversarial methods for attacking industrial systems. We've worked, for example, on poisoning methods that can break Google's AutoML API. We've worked on adversarial attacks on high-frequency trading algorithms. We've worked on adversarial attacks on copyright detection systems. We worked on a bunch of different kinds of things, but recently I've gotten more interested in how you can use adversarial ML for social good. How can we use machine learning to try to combat problems that are currently happening in the social atmosphere of machine learning? And I'm particularly interested in how you can use adversarial machine learning to protect user privacy. So there's a problem that has been happening over the last few years where a lot of private information gets scraped from social media websites. I think Facebook oftentimes gets thrown under the bus when we're talking about personal information getting leaked from social media, but actually I think LinkedIn is probably the biggest culprit. They make a lot of personal information available, oftentimes without even having any sort of relationship with someone. You can see an image of their face, you can see what they do for a living, and you can see where they live. And if you want to build a face recognition system, having their face associated with their name and the location where they live, all of those are really important things for building facial recognition systems. And there are companies that scrape this information from the web and then sell identity information en masse to various organizations. One of these companies is Clearview AI. This is a company that's been in the media a bunch, but actually I think there's a number of companies that are doing this, just haven't gotten put under a microscope the way that Clearview AI has been. But Clearview AI has at numerous times claimed that they don't sell this US identity information to foreign entities. But then there was a leak from Clearview AI where it turned out that they did. They've claimed that they weren't working with certain extremist political organizations, but then leaks came out, it turned out that they were. And so they sell your personal information to private companies, political organizations, foreign governments, law enforcement agencies, and they're scraping information in a way that generally violates the terms of the websites that they have, that they're scraping it from. In some situations, this sort of scraping is probably even illegal. For example, in the state of Illinois, there are very strong laws that prohibit collection of this kind of biometric information. And so one of the questions I've been wondering is there a way to de-incentivize this kind of scraping behavior by making data that is available on the internet useless? Is it possible to poison this data in such a way that even if organizations do scrape it, it's not possible to use it to train models, and it's not possible to use this data for facial recognition? And there's a couple approaches to this problem. One is you could try to make what are called unlearnable examples, and there's a growing literature on unlearnable examples. I'll just tell you a bit about an approach from my lab that I think is particularly conceptually interesting. But the idea behind unlearnable data is that you want to poison a data set so that it's essentially useless for training deep neural networks. If you were to scrape this data set, you could train neural networks on it, but it wouldn't do you any good. You'd be better off just randomly initializing your neural networks and never looking at this data at all. Is it possible to make data that is useless? I'm going to present to you a method that's essentially inspired by distillation, a method that uses adversarial examples to create unlearnable data. And at the time this came out, this is the state of the art. We actually recently just had a paper that was accepted to NeurIPS that managed to do this in a bit of a stronger way. But I think this method is a bit more conceptually interesting. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so suppose that you have some images. So images of cats. Suppose that a neural network slices input space into parts, into classes, right? So let's say you have a classifier that classifies ImageNet images. So it can classify, say, cats, and it can classify frogs. There's some decision boundary between these two things, and all the cats live on one side of the decision boundary. We'll call that Catland. All the frogs live on the other side of the decision boundary. I'm going to call that Frogville. So we've got all these cat images floating around in Catland, all these frog images floating around in Frogville. Now I'm going to make adversarial examples for these two images. So I'm going to make an adversarial perturbation that scooches the cat across the decision boundary using noise, adversarial noise. And I'm uses a schematic. So I'm adding a lot more noise to this image just so you can tell it's supposed to be noisy. In real life, we would add much less noise than this, and it would probably even be an invisible perturbation. So I'm going to take this frog, and I'm also going to scooch that across the decision boundary. And I'm going to throw away the original images. And now I ask the question, how do you want to label these if you're planning to train a neural network on them? Well, if you're planning to train a neural network on them and you want to reconstruct these original ResNet 50 boundaries, the boundaries for the original ImageNet, then you need to label this frog as a cat, and you should label this cat as a frog. Reason being that this data point lies in Catland. And so if you were to train, take a point in Catland, put it in your data set and label it as a frog, that would move the decision boundary so that this region was considered to be a frog, but this is right in the middle of cat land, right? So if you move the decision boundary, you're going to misclassify a lot of cats. And likewise, this image here, it lives in Frogville, even though it looks like a cat to you and me. If you want to train a neural network on it and recover the original resident 50 boundaries, you need to label this as a frog because it's right in the middle of the space where all the frog images live. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive, but if you want to train a neural network on these images, you have to label them in a way that humans would consider to be wrong. To a machine, these images appear to be labeled correctly, but to a human, they appear to be labeled incorrectly. And if you want to train on a neural network on these kinds of images, this is how you have to label them. So you might do something like this. This is a CFAR image, so it looks a little bit fuzzy. I'll show an image and an example later. But this is an example of an image of a frog. And I'm going to add an adversarial perturbation, move it into cat land. And on the right, you'll see the adversarial perturbation. The epsilon we're using, the size of the perturbation is very small. And so it's very difficult for a person to perceive the difference. I can't perceive the difference on these images, even when I look very closely. But a neural network thinks that this should be labeled as a cat. And so if you want to train a neural network on this image, you would take these images that humans would consider to be frogs, you got to label them as cats, and then you stick them in the data set. And so you're training on images that a human would think are labeled wrong, but to a neural network, they are labeled correct. And actually, if you were to train on such images, so this is just training on images that humans think are wrong, this is the confusion matrix for CFAR 10. And you'll see it's got this really strong diagonal here, and all the off-diagonal entries are very small. And that shows that this confusion matrix is showing that a neural network that is trained on these images that humans think are all labeled incorrectly, if you test it on clean data, so things that are not adversarially perturbed and that a human thinks are labeled correctly, it's able to get most things correct. So you can get a pretty highly functional classifier by training on things that humans think are labeled wrong. But that's because they're labeled as, they're given the label that corresponds to the region of input space that a neural network thinks that they should be in. Okay, so there's an interesting conceptual experiment. We created data that humans think is labeled wrong, but machines think is labeled correctly. So then that asks the question, what does it have to do with untrainable data? Can I make an unlearnable version of ImageNet by using a related trick, right? So what we want to do is the opposite of what I just described. I want to make images that are labeled correctly to a human. So to a human user, they see these images, they see the labels, or you look at a website, you'll see an image of a face, you'll see the name below it, and everything seems fine. You don't even notice that anything's been changed. But to a computer, I want all of those labels to be completely wrong. So if you train on that data, you just get garbage results. You're training on data with incorrect labels. So here's how we're going to do that. We're going to take this example here. Remember, in this example, the images are labeled correctly to a computer, but they're labeled wrong to a machine. Let's just flip those. Oops, I think I said that. Wait, what did I say? Go back. These images are labeled correctly to a machine, but incorrectly to a human. I'm just going to flip-flop those labels. So now they are labeled correctly to a human, but incorrectly to a machine. So if you were to train, these images might look like they're labeled correctly to you and me, but if you were to train on them, you're basically training on poison data. You have an image that's labeled as a frog, but it's living right in the middle of the cat input space. And when you train on this kind of data, it messes up the accuracy of your classifier. Here's an example doing this on ImageNet. So it is an ImageNet image that is, to a human, it should be labeled as a hen, but we added a small adversarial perturbation and we knock it into ostrich input space. If you want to train a neural network on this, you should label this as an ostrich. If you want to train humans to recognize these things, you should probably call it a hen. So the correct label depends on your perspective. A human would assign would consider the hen label to be correct, whereas a machine would consider the ostrich label to be correct. So if you train on these kinds of unlearnable examples, even though they look to a human, these data sets we're training on look exactly like the original data sets. It doesn't look like there's anything perturbed in them at all. It actually has a huge negative impact on neural network training. So if you train a Resnet 18 on a clean CFAR 10 data set, you can get 95% accuracy. If you train it on one of these visually identical CFAR 10 unlearnable data sets, you actually get worse than random. You get 6% accuracy. So you'd actually be better off putting monkeys at typewriters or using a randomly initialized network than you would be using a neural network that was trained on this unlearnable data. And what's interesting is that we actually crafted these adversarial examples using the Resonant 18 architecture. So it's not too surprising that if you train a Resonant 18, then that's effective. What's interesting is that it doesn't seem to matter what architecture you use. We can use VGG, we can use MobileNet, we can use GooglyNet. These are all very different architectures, and yet you still get very poor performance, oftentimes worse than random if you train on this kind of unlearnable data. Okay, so that's an example that shows how you can prevent data from being scraped and then used to train machine learning systems. But in face recognition, oftentimes when images are being scraped, they're not actually being used to train a system. They're just being put into a library that you can use for some sort of matching task like face recognition. So is it possible to poison images in such a way that they cannot be used for face recognition, even using a pre-trained model, which is commonly done? So first, I'll just say a few things about how face recognition typically works. So in face recognition, we typically use what are called Siamese networks. So a Siamese network, you have what's called a gallery image. This is an image that you might scrape from the internet. So it comes from Facebook, it comes from LinkedIn. This is the kind of thing that gets scraped from the web and labeled with your identity. So we push this image through a neural network, and that maps it onto a feature vector. So this is an image of Yoda. It lies in this region near all the other Yoda images. And this feature extractor is trained in such a way that images from the same identity cluster together, but images from different identities lie far apart. So Yoda, all the Yoda images lie over here, but all the Boba Fett and all the Mando images lie in different regions of feature space. So you have these gallery images, and you map them all into this feature space, and then you have some footage that comes along where you want to perform face recognition. Maybe this comes from a security camera, this comes from some sort of situation in real life, and you go to your face recognition system, and you run a face localization algorithm that extracts the face, pushes it through this neural network, and then you just see where it lies in feature space. And in this case, it lies closest to the Yoda cluster. And so you say that's an image of Yoda. We're able to match it to an image from the gallery. But this neural network is generally pre-trained. It will be pre-trained on some large pre-collected data set. This Yoda image that was collected for the gallery was collected after the network was trained, and it was just mapped through the network, and it's stuck into this database of gallery images. So we don't actually have to train on these images that we're scraping from the web. We can just use them to collect identities. So we created this system called Low-Key. What Low-Key does is it filters your images so that they don't map to the regions of feature space that you would expect them to. It essentially adds a small adversarial perturbation to your image so that when your gallery image goes through a neural network, it lies in a very strange location in feature space that matches to the wrong identity. The idea being that if these images that are poisoned, these poisoned images get scraped from the web, and you try and use this gallery images, they can't be used for accurate face recognition when an unpoisoned image comes through later on. So now if you were to, so if let's say that Yoda's, baby Yoda's images are all low-key filtered, if you then get a natural image in the wild and you push that through this feature extractor, it's going to lie in a region of feature space that is empty because all the gallery images have been perturbed to strange locations. So we train these adversarial perturbations. We create adversarial perturbations for an image in such a way that it can break all sorts of different kinds of face detectors. So what we do is we essentially solve an objective. We maximize an objective that says, find a perturbed image X that lies as far away from the original base image in feature space as possible. So in feature space, it moves really far away from where it should be. But in an LPIPS metric, which is a visual similarity metric, it measures how similar two images appear. I want that image to be very close to the original. So to a human, I don't want there to be strong visible perturbations. And when we create these adversarial perturbations, we don't just pick one neural network architecture, we pick a whole bunch. So we create a perturbation that simultaneously breaks ArcFace and CoastFace, which are two well-known, they're two popular face recognition architectures. And we ensemble over different backbones, and we try different pre-processing methods. We make sure the perturbations can break blurring, JPEG, cropping. And so we're going to test this algorithm using a very large set of images. So we create adversarial perturbations for a large set of images, and then we're going to test. We create those adversarial perturbations using backbones and neural networks that are trained on MS Celeb, which is a large open face recognition data set. And we create perturbed face images that look like this. So the top is unperturbed and the bottom is filtered with low-key. I still think that this is an area where we need to do more work. So when I talked about unlearnable data is actually very effective. You can make unlearnable data using invisible perturbations, very tiny perturbations. To reliably break commercial face recognition systems, we have to make perturbations to gallery images that are usually perceptible. Sometimes they're more perceptible than others, but I think more work can be done to make these things less perceptible. Right now, the problem is people are generally not willing to accept any perceptible change to their face images. Even though the changes we have to make are quite small, I still think this may need to be improved for it to be applicable in a commercial setting. But even using these kinds of small perturbations are already quite effective. So this is testing our perturbations against commercial APIs. So the Amazon Recognition API gets 93.7% on a data set with about 1 million identities. So that's pretty accurate. It can give you a top match and with one guess, 93.7% of the time when discriminating between 1 million people. If we filter your gallery images through Loki, then that accuracy degenerates to 0.6%. And I'll point out that we don't know what kind of system Amazon is using. I don't know what method they're using for face cropping. I don't know how they're rescaling images to a standard resolution. I don't know how their network was trained. I don't know what backbone they use. I don't know what head that they use. I don't even know anything about what general kind of architecture they're using or what training pipeline they have. But by ensembling over these different academic systems, we can actually make something that's pretty effective, does a pretty effective black box attack against these commercial face recognition systems. Now, Amazon doesn't just give you a top 1 guess, though. Amazon can actually give you a top 50 list of matches. And if you give it 50 guesses, this accuracy goes back up to about 2.4%. Microsoft Azure's recognition API, not quite as strong as Amazon's, gets about 90.5% accuracy on clean images. It doesn't give you top 50 matches, but if you do a nearest neighbor match using this Microsoft Azure API, you get about 0.1% accuracy if the gallery images are filtered through Loki. So it's only correct about 1 in 1,000 times. Okay, so if there's any questions, now would actually be a great time. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about a different kind of machine learning system. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. All right. So everything that I just spoke about in the first half of the talk pertained to what is called type 1 thinking, or sometimes called fast thinking. And this is essentially just pattern recognition. Almost all of the neural networks that we have today are just doing pattern recognition. So you might show them a picture of a dog and it says, that's a dog. This is something that humans do very efficiently. And very often we can do it without any sort of what we would consider to be reasoning. Which is why this is oftentimes called fast thinking. Pattern recognition tasks are basically instantaneous for humans, and pattern recognition tasks are something that neural networks are very, very good at. But humans also have a cognitive capability called slow thinking or type 2 thinking, and this is what you might associate with logical reasoning. So humans can do chained logical reasoning where they think about, they basically think through a tree of different possible outcomes, and they reason about what's going to happen in the future. Because we have the ability to do type 2 thinking, we are good at things that machines tend to be bad at. So machines tend to be good at pattern recognition, things like object detection, face recognition, the things I spoke about in the first half of this talk. But humans are really good at logical reasoning. And because of that, humans have a lot of capabilities that machines can't. So for example, humans can exhibit what's called logical extrapolation. So we can learn to solve easy problems, and then we can glue together the strategies that we learned, and we can synthesize much more complex strategies for much more complicated problems. So for example, if I give you a math book and I teach you to prove simple theorems, I could then, presuming you're a strong math student, I could then give you a much more difficult theorem, and you'd still be able to solve it, provided that I give you a longer amount of time to think. So by exerting more cognitive effort, you might have to think for longer, but you can extrapolate your knowledge and solve much more difficult problems than you were trained on. That's called logical extrapolation. This is something that is really important to human reasoning, but it's something that is not so clear that neural networks can exhibit that kind of reasoning. That's another reason, for example, that humans are so efficient at learning to play chess. And this is a problem that we'll take a look at the end of this talk. We'll look back at chess. A professional human chess player has played maybe 20, 30,000 chess games in their entire life. It's a world-class chess player. A very strong AI for playing chess, if you use a system like Mu0, which is based on DeepMind's AlphaZero, but for chess, if you take a state-of-the-art RL-based system for chess, it needs to play about 1 billion games to be as good as a world-class chess player, right? So a human is able to learn chess in tens of thousands of games. A machine needs billions of games. The reason why humans are so effective at learning chess is because of our logical extrapolation ability. In essence, we can think, right? We play a game, we make mistakes, and we learn lessons. And then we take the lessons that we learn and we can synthesize much more complex strategies. We can think deeper into the game. Because we have logical reasoning abilities, we don't just have to learn by guess and check. We can also increase our power by reasoning deeper and thinking for longer. And that logical extrapolation ability is really important human ability. So the question I want to ask is, can we build neural networks that exhibit logical extrapolation? In essence, I want to know whether we can build neural networks that can think. I would like to build neural networks that can we train them to solve easy problems, simple problems, and then I want to see whether they can figure out how to solve harder problems if we just give them longer to think. And that's a big generalization leap. We generally assume that neural networks won't solve problems that are outside of their training distribution. Here, I'm explicitly asking them to do that. I'm going to train on a distribution of very simple problems, and then I want to see if the neural network, given a longer amount of thinking time, by exerting more cognitive effort, can it figure out how to solve harder problems that are outside of that distribution. And the way that we're going to do this is by emulating a model of how humans think. So if you look at a computational model of the human mind, there are models of the human mind in which we have what's called working memory. That's just sort of a representation space for storing problems. And we have what's called central executive, which is just the mechanisms in the brain that manipulate those representations in order to solve a problem. And in the standard computational model of the human brain, the memory space gets manipulated in a temporal way. It gets manipulated over time. And there are different cognitive theories that describe this kind of behavior. The visual spatial sketchpad is one such theory. You're familiar with that. The idea is that we can manipulate this representation over time. And because thinking is a temporal process, it takes us longer to solve problems that are hard than it does to solve problems that are easy. So I want to build a machine that replicates this kind of behavior. And here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to train a recurrent network to solve problems. One of the problems I like to focus on is maze solving. So I'll train a neural network to solve really easy mazes. I'll just show it pictures of a maze, and the neural network has to spit out a picture of a solution to that maze. And I'm going to use a recurrent network to solve this. So I'll let the recurrent network run for 30 iterations at train time. You can do 30 recurrences. Then at test time, I can run that recurrent unit for as long as I want. So it's, in its essence, I can let the network think for longer. And the question is whether it can make a generalization leap and solve more difficult problems than it was trained on if we unroll the architecture and we let it think for longer at test time. So the first thing we have to do is you have to replace feed-forward computation with recurrence to make this work. So a standard feed-forward model, like say Resident 18, every layer of the neural network is unique. It has different parameters in every layer. The problem with a network like this is that the complexity of the problems is inherently limited by the depth. Resident 18 can never solve a problem that requires more than 18 sequential operations. And also, every one of those layers in Resident 18 is unique. So if you wanted to increase its power after it's trained, there's really no way to do that. There's no way to add a 19th layer after the network is trained. But with recurrent models, you can. So if you have a recurrent architecture where a problem is mapped into a representation space, you have some input layer, and then I have this, all the intermediate layers here are identical, they use the same parameters. And then finally, I have a solution extractor at the end that looks at the representations that come out of this recurrent unit and maps them onto a solution to the problem. The nice thing about this recurrent models is that I can just run these recurrent units as many times as I want. So if you had an 18-layer network, I could then expand that to a 19-layer network just by running the recurrent unit for longer. Now, you might think recurrent networks would behave really differently than feed-forward networks. Interestingly, they don't. And so here's a plot that shows the performance of neural networks as a function of their effective depth. And we have blue, in the blue, we show the performance of feed-forward networks, and in orange, we show the performance of recurrent networks. Same architectures as feed-forward, but with parameter sharing between all of the layers. And what's interesting is that the relationship between depth and accuracy actually looks the same, regardless of whether we use feed-forward computation or recurrent computation. Sometimes we even see non-monotonic behaviors happening here, like this S-shaped curve here, and you see that exact same non-monotonicity regardless of whether we use parameter sharing or whether we use independent parameters per layer. So it actually turns out that using recurrence instead of feed-forward networks, it doesn't really change very much. In fact, if we train ImageNet classifiers using using recurrence instead of a feed-forward architecture, and we do feature visualizations at different layers in the network, so this is using different layers from VGG, what we find is that we can get almost identical features out of every layer of the network, regardless of whether it's recurrent or feed-forward. So the behaviors of these networks really seem to be almost identical. You might think you would lose a lot of network power by forcing yourself to use recurrence instead of feed-forward architectures, but in reality, it turns out you lose almost nothing. So we have these recurrent architectures. Now we need a way to control the hardness of a problem. I want to be able to make easy problems that I train on and then test on hard problems. And I'll do that just using procedurally generated mazes. I can write algorithms that will generate random mazes. So I'll generate a maze and I'll put a green dot in to be a starting point and a red dot to be the ending point. I'll solve this maze using a classical algorithm. I'll solve it with a classical algorithm so that I can produce the solution, looks like this. And this is the label. I'm going to train these recurrent networks. They get to see a picture of the maze, and then they have to spit out this label. And I'll just use a per pixel classification accuracy loss to train this, just a very simple loss function. An interesting thing about these networks is that it seems like they are able to exhibit logical extrapolation. So this is an example where I train only on 9x9 mazes, and I test on 13x13. So I'm asking it to make a generalization leap. If I train on 9x9 and I test on 9x9, it's very easy to get 100% accuracy. Even a very simple feed-forward network has 100% accuracy. If I train on 9x9 and test on 13x13, then I find that feed-forward, the best feed-forward architecture we can find using an architecture search, gets about 25% accuracy. That's this dotted line here. But the best recurrent network we can find does about 50% accuracy, so about twice as high as an accuracy. And if you let it, even though we trained it here for 20 iterations, if you let it work for longer at test time, that accuracy goes up to about 70%. So it's able to solve more problems just by thinking for longer. It seems like it's exhibiting logical extrapolation. So this is one of our first results in this space. And when we figured this out, I thought this was really interesting, but it's not so impressive to be able to solve 70% of 13x13 mazes. You would hope that we'd be able to accomplish a bit more than that. So for our second paper on this topic, we kind of went back to the drawing board and we tried to figure out what the problem was with these systems. You'll see that if you let them think for long enough, the performance goes up and then it actually starts to fall down a little bit. We call that overthinking. So we tried to find a way to solve this overthinking problem. And the way that we did that is just by introducing skip connections to the architecture. So a standard a recurrent architecture has a feature embedding layer, and then it has the same recurrent block over and over again. We introduced what we call recall connections. Recall connections are just skip connections that go from the input layer into the to the input of every one of these recurrent blocks. So every time you run the recurrent block, it gets to see the features from the currents before it, and it also gets to see features that come from the input layer. Now, this is an important architectural modification. The reason why it's important is because if you run the recurrence for long enough, it's possible that the network can no longer remember the problem that it's trying to solve. Essentially, the representation starts to get noisy and degenerate, and it no longer knows the problem that it's trying to solve. And this is one of the primary reasons that overthinking occurs. If you have these skip connections, you can no longer forget what problem you're working on, and so there's no reason why that should be a difficulty anymore. And what we find is that these skip connections actually solve the overthinking problem. So this shows the number of test time iterations on the x-axis versus the accuracy on 13x13 mazes on the y-axis. And what we find is that these in dotted lines here, we have the original recurrent architectures without skip connections. And these have accuracy that goes up to about 70, 80%, and then it falls back down to 0 because of overthinking. But if we introduce these skip connections and we get these solid curves that just increase over time and they hit 100%, they solve every 13 by 13 instance. And keep in mind, I was only trained on 9 by 9, but it generalizes to 13 by 13, and it solves 100% of these problems. But to get there, we have to do about 100 iterations, even though we only trained on 30. And so I thought, that's interesting. I wonder if we can go bigger than 13 by 13. So this is training on 9 by 9 and going to 59 by 59. Once you get to problems this big, this dotted line at the bottom is all of the standard feed-forward and naive recurrent architectures. So we find that all of these get 0% accuracy. There's, even with the feed-forward architecture doing a hyperparameter search over the depth and the width, we cannot find an architecture that can solve a single one of these 59 by 59 problems. And that's because of the domain shift. It's only trained on 9 by 9. These 59 by 59 problems are just outside of the training distribution, and that domain shift destroys these systems. But if you let these recurrent architectures think for long enough, they eventually figure out how to solve 100% of these problems. But to do that, you need to run for about 750 recurrences, even though they were only trained with 30. So this is interesting, and I thought, I wonder how big we can scale up. It might be the case that these systems can figure out how to solve problems of arbitrary complexity. So here's a demo of different kinds of problems that we can solve. So the first thing we looked at is just a simple problem that can be solved with a for loop. This is called the prefix sum problem. We chose this problem to look at because it's been really well studied in the machine learning literature. There's a lot of literature on different forms of complexity for this problem, on different, the sample complexity of different learning methods for this problem. The way that this problem works is you give a machine a sequence of bits, you give it an input sequence, and then the target, the output that it has to predict, is the cumulative sum of the inputs mod 2. So it basically just counts up how many ones there are up to a position in the input and computes that sum mod 2, and that needs to be at a position, the corresponding position in the output. You can create a for loop that'll just sweep over the input sequence and generate the output sequence. This doesn't require any branching, doesn't require any complex logic. It's just a simple algorithm. And I want to know whether a neural network just trained on input and output sequences can synthesize this algorithm autonomously. And so to test that, we're going to train on short sequences and we'll test on long sequences. So if we train on 32-bit sequences and we test on 512-bit sequences, what we find is that all the naive and feed-forward architectures get 0% accuracy. They can't generalize to these longer sequences. It's outside the training distribution. Now, we only trained for 30 iterations when we train these recurrent architectures. And if we train with 30 iterations on 32 bits, then we test with 32 iterations on 512 bits, they get 0% accuracy. They also fail. But what we find is if you let them think for long enough, they eventually start to figure out how to solve problems. If you let them run for about 100 iterations of test time, they start to get correct solutions on some of these problems. And once you've been thinking for about 500 iterations, you hit 100% accuracy. You solve all of these problems. But the network has to think for a very long time in order to cross that generalization gap. Then we have a problem that requires, so that was just a simple for loop algorithm. We have a problem that requires branching. That would be this maze problem. So let's say that we train only on 9 by 9 mazes with 30 iterations. So this is the extent of the training data. This is what it looks like. We can test on a 201 by 201 maze, and it will eventually find a solution to this problem if you let it run for 2,400 iterations. So I then said to my students, let's just solve the biggest problem we can. What's the biggest maze we can solve? And this turns out this is the biggest maze we can solve. It has a green dot over here and a red dot over here. The reason why this is the biggest problem is actually just because this is the biggest thing that we can fit into GPU memory. Once we try to go bigger than this, we can no longer fit the whole network into GPU RAM. There's probably some optimizations we can do to get around this. But using our simple implementation, this is the biggest we can fit on the GPU. This is an 801 by 801 maze. If we let a network run for long enough, it will find this solution. But it takes 20,000 recurrences. Our recurrent block actually has 5 convolutions in it. So this is equivalent to about 100,000 convolutional layers. So in essence, we're basically running ResNet 100,000. It's a 100,000 layer convolutional network. And even though it's only trained on those tiny little 9 by 9 mazes, it can solve these really complex problems. So I wanted to know how it's solving these problems. What kind of algorithm is this neural network synthesizing? We don't give it any supervision over how to break the problem down or any supervision over what the algorithm should look like, but it's synthesizing some sort of algorithm. What does that algorithm look like? So if we let the neural network run and we try to extract the solution out after every recurrence, what we find is that it's doing a classical parallel algorithm called dead-end filling. So when I saw this visualization, I went to read about different maze solving algorithms. I eventually figured out that this is dead-end filling. It's a well-known algorithm. This is the algorithm that the neural network finds. And so that really took a lot of mystery out of it for me. And that was actually really nice because it turned out a neural network is capable of synthesizing a classical algorithm autonomously. But it was also a little disappointing because I thought maybe the neural network was doing some much more complex behaviors. But when we probe a little bit deeper, it turns out the network is doing much more complex behaviors. It's using algorithms that I'm not even sure how to explain. So if we let this solve the maze halfway, and then we corrupt its memory with a huge amount of Gaussian noise, we put the solution into this state. So we just added a huge amount of Gaussian noise to memory, totally corrupted the memory state, totally corrupted the solution. If we do this and we let the network keep running, it will pause and then it repairs its broken memories and it will solve the problem. And it actually solves it faster than it would if you had started from scratch. So it's using some sort of error correction code to repair its damaged memories and then get back on track and solve the problem. What else is interesting is if I solve this maze to its completion, and then I move the blue and the red dot to different locations, then the network will generate a new solution, but it does it by generating a path contiguously from the green dot toward the red dot, and then it basically digests that path toward the red dot until these two paths that it generates meets in the middle. And it does that without making any wrong turns through the maze along the way. It just manages to synthesize this whole thing in one shot. And it seems like it's using some sort of tree search type behavior to do this, but I'm not exactly sure how it's doing it. Somehow it's able to recycle the tableau of work that it did in the original maze configuration to reconstruct a solution to this altered maze very quickly. Okay, and then finally, I want to look at a challenge problem. This is chess. We're running a little short on time, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly through this. But there is a server called, a website called leadchess.org, where people can play chess against each other. And lead chess will find human game states that occur during human games, and it will put those into a data set of what it calls chess puzzles if it believes that there's a single game theoretically optimal move. It uses a very powerful chess engine called Stockfish to figure out whether there's only a unique best move, and it'll put that game state in the library of chess puzzles, and a human can look at that and try to figure out on their own what this optimal state is. And so every one of these puzzles has what's called an ELO score. It's ranked for difficulty by looking at what percentage of humans can solve it. If everyone can solve a problem, it gets a low ELO score. If very few people can solve a problem, it gets a high ELO score. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 1 million of these chess puzzles from LeadChess, and I'm going to sort them from easy to hard. And I'm going to take the first 600,000 easiest and make that the train set. And I'll take 200,000 hardest in this set that I have obtained, and I'll call that the test set. We're going to train on easy and we're going to test on hard. And what we find is that a feed-forward network can get about 60% accuracy on this task. And this is doing an architecture search over different feed-forward architectures. But if we just take that same architecture and training loop from the maze solving problem without doing any additional architecture searching, we can actually beat the best feed-forward network by about 20% of accuracy points. And what's more interesting to me is that the network continues to improve the longer you let it run. So if you let it run outside of the training regime, let it run for longer than it trained for, it will actually figure out how to solve chess puzzles that it was not able to solve using the original amount of allocated time. So if you let this think for longer, it exhibits logical extrapolation, and it's actually able to become a more powerful chess player just by exerting more cognitive effort. Okay, so I'll wrap up. Some thoughts about thinking. One of the things that makes neural networks, that makes thinking systems interesting is that it seems like they're generalizing to problems that aren't in the training distribution. Now, you might think that if you train a neural network on a training distribution and you test it on a completely disjoint test distribution, which is what we're doing here, that it should fail, right? A neural architecture should not just be able to transfer to a completely disjoint distribution. The domain shift should damage performance. And if you think that the network should fail, then you're actually correct. These architectures, in some sense, they do fail when you test them on harder problems. If I take this 30 iteration network, so like a depth 30 network roughly, and I train it on easy problems, and I test the same depth 30 network on hard problems, it will fail to solve any of them. It gets completely destroyed by this shift. But if we then change the model, so I unroll the model into a deeper architecture after it's been trained just by unrolling that recurrence, now the network becomes more powerful. And so we've essentially changed the architecture. We changed the model. That's how we cross that generalization gap. When we unroll the network and we let it run for longer, we get a deeper model that has different decision boundaries than the original model. And those different decision boundaries are able to solve these more complex problems. And so there's something interesting going on, and I'm not quite sure how to fit this into classical generalization theory, but I think that this generalization leap, this kind of logical extrapolation behavior is interesting, just because it's hard to fit it into classical generalization theories. Another interesting thing is that the thinking systems that I've described, they only see a problem and its solution, and they're able to synthesize an algorithm for solving these problems, a scalable algorithm. Now, there are neural networks for learning algorithms that have been proposed. For example, there's neural Turing machines. Neural Turing machines get supervision over what each step of the algorithm should do. So you let a system run incrementally, but on every step, you tell it exactly what should be accomplished at that step. So you're giving it human supervision over how to break the problem down into steps and what the algorithm should accomplish. In this case, we're just showing it a problem and a solution, and the neural network actually synthesizes the entire algorithm autonomously with no human supervision over what each step of the algorithm should look like, or even how many steps there should be. Although we do have to limit it to a certain number of recurrences at train time, in this case, 30. Another interesting thought is that thinking systems could potentially replace handcrafted algorithms for ML systems. An example of a handcrafted algorithm would be something like AlphaGo or AlphaZero, the DeepMind's system for playing Go. These systems actually rely very strongly on handcrafted algorithms. AlphaGo and AlphaZero both rely on a handcrafted Monte Carlo tree search. This is the same kind of tree search that was used to defeat humans at chess in the 90s. The only thing that deep learning really does is it prunes the tree. So as you're doing the tree search, it looks at a branch in the tree and says, you know what, I don't think going down this branch is very productive. Let's cut that branch off the tree. So it's essentially just used to assist in this handcrafted algorithm. What's interesting is that, at least for mazes, which is a simpler problem class, we observed that neural networks can actually synthesize algorithms for solving these problems. And even in the case of these more complicated chess problems, it seems like the neural network can synthesize an algorithmic approach through end-to-end training for solving these problems. And so it might be possible to come up with end-to-end learned systems for these kinds of planning problems without having to rely on human supervision. Okay, and that's it. Here's just a list of some of the papers that I spoke about, if you're interested in these sorts of things. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen. And thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really happy that I could be here. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to stick around and answer them.
Thank you very much, Tom. So to the audience, please type your questions into the Q&A feature. And while we're waiting for the audience to type their questions, and I want to ask you, so I actually, when you show the first few examples of the learning system, seemed that with more thinking, it was able to converge to 100%. And I was actually going to ask whether this always happened, but then in your chess example, it showed that it kind of stagnated at a 70 or 80%, and it stopped improving. Do you have any thoughts on why or how this is happening?
Yeah, you know, chess is very different than mazes, in that it's not possible to think through an entire game of chess without seeing some empirical data. Like, for example, it's not possible. There's in theory, there's a game theoretically optimal opening move in chess, and nobody knows what that opening move is. The game is too big, even with, and you know, actually chess is known to be EX complete, it's EXP complete. Even with an enormous amount of computation, it is not possible to compute the optimal move all the time. And so for a system to perform well, it has to see a certain amount of empirical data. This system is trained on a relatively small data set. And as a result, I don't think I wouldn't expect it to be possible for it to achieve optimal performance in all situations, just because it lacks that empirical data. So everything that it does would have to be solved in some sense by a brute force search and with the small amount of data that it's gleaned. That being said, I do wonder if it's possible to get thinking systems to work better. One thing I mentioned is that we didn't do any architecture searching on chess, and that was just because it takes a long time to train, and our meager academic GPU cluster can't really handle doing a big architecture search. I wonder if we can close some of that gap just by architecture searching. But even if we did, I don't expect to close all the gap. I think that chess is like the tree for chess is just explodes so wide so fast that I don't think that you can get there without training on a large amount of data.
I see, very interesting. So we have a question here from Varun. Could you explain what you mean by unrolling the architecture at test time? What weights would layers that you introduced have?
So yeah, when I say unrolling, what I mean is just that when you train, there's a recurrent unit in the middle of the network, right? And at train time, we run that recurrent unit for 30 iterations. So if there's a single convolution op in that recurrent unit, in practice, we usually use 5 ops per unit, although I don't think that number matters very much. But if there's one convolution op in the recurrent unit, then if you ran it 30 times that train time, you think of this as a depth 30 network where there's parameter sharing between every layer. When I talk about unrolling, what I really mean is like you train with 30 iterations, so you train with a 30 layer network, and then at test time, I'm just going to repeat that same layer over and over again, and I'm going to expand that network to being deeper. So for example, at test time, we had that example where we solved that really big maze. We took something with 30 recurrent units at train time, and we unrolled it by just repeating that recurrent unit over and over again until it was 105,000 convolutional operations. And then that super deep architecture is able to solve this problem. In practice, we don't actually explicitly unroll it. We just run the recurrent unit over and over again. And that prevents us from having to store all the memory and states along the way. Hope that answers the question.
All right, we have this other question from Michael here. How is the recurrent solving larger problems different from starting from a pre-trained feed-forward network and applying to a new similar data set?
Oh, okay. So if you were to, I might have a slide for this. Let me see. Here we go. If we train feed-forward models on different size mazes, what we find is that the depth that you need to solve a maze is dependent on the size of the maze. So to solve these larger mazes, we do need deeper networks. Now this is using feed-forward architectures, not just recurrent. So even with so if you want to solve a huge maze, you cannot do that with, say, a 2-layer network. There's a certain amount of branching and logic that has to happen to solve a maze, and you cannot solve a large maze with 2 sequential operations. It's just not possible. And in fact, for the one of the reasons we like the prefix sum problem is that there's a literature that actually analyzes the minimal number of sequential operations that you need, and it's known that that grows with the problem size. So if you took a relatively shallow feed-forward network and you pre-trained it on small mazes and you tried to fine-tune it on large mazes, if those mazes were large enough, it would fail. Having said that, though, the 30 recurrent unit mazes or networks that we train are actually able to solve pretty big mazes. So I know, for example, they can solve a 50 by 50 maze if you train them on that domain. Right. So in this case, if you took a feed-forward architecture and you trained it, a sufficiently deep feed-forward architecture, trained on 50 by 50 mazes, it can solve 50 by 50 mazes. If you train it on 800 by 800 mazes, it can solve 800 by 800 mazes. Although training it on mazes of that size would be very expensive and take a huge amount of memory. What's interesting here is not that we can solve the harder problems, it's that we solve the problems through logical extrapolation. So the network is able to train only on the easy problems and then figure out how to solve the harder problems. But if we were just to train in that space of harder problems to begin with, then the network would be able to succeed inside of the training distribution that it was trained on.
All right, I think we're at time. So thank you very much, Tom, again, for this very, very interesting talk. And I thank the audience for your attendance. See you next week. All right, thanks very much.